They had already written his name in the report, Kia. By morning, he was breathing. The night air over the Tunisian plain was thick with heat and diesel smoke. The field hospital squatted in the dust like a dying animal, canvas flapping against the desert wind. Inside, the lamps burned low, their glass fogged with flies and ash. Men moaned on stretchers, some half-conscious, others already gone. The smell was a mixture of blood, sweat, and something sour that never quite washed away. It was the 15th of March, 1943. They brought him in just after midnight. Sergeant James Wilson, 26, shot through the abdomen during a night raid near Medjez-el-Bab. The stretcher-bearers moved fast, shouting for a surgeon. The bullet had torn through his intestines, infection was already spreading. His skin was the color of parchment, his eyes half open but empty. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell, the youngest medical officer in the tent, helped lift him onto the operating table. His hands trembled, not from fear but exhaustion. They'd been awake nearly 20 hours. The generator coughed once and went silent. Only the hiss of the lantern filled the gap. The senior doctor, Colonel Laird, leaned over the wound and exhaled sharply. Through and through, he muttered. He's septic already. Even if we operate, he won't make it till dawn. The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace Helton, one of the nurses, stood beside the table, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her voice barely a whisper. You should write to his mother, she said. No one answered. The sound of flies returned. Maxwell's gaze drifted to the corner of the tent, where supplies were stacked, boxes stamped with faded British lettering. He'd seen them unloaded that morning, gauze, morphine, surgical soap, and a small crate with a single glass vial wrapped in wax paper. A label, printed in neat black ink, penicillin, experimental use only. He remembered the words of a briefing weeks earlier in Algiers, something about a new antibacterial compound, not yet approved for field use. Too little of it existed. Only a few ampoules had reached the front lines, reserved for high-ranking officers or controlled trials. He hadn't told anyone he'd found one. Maxwell stood beside Wilson's cot long after the others left. The sergeant's breathing was shallow, rattling in his chest. Every exhale came slower than the last. Sweat darkened his bandages. Grace checked his pulse and shook her head. He's fading, she whispered. Outside, the desert wind shifted, carrying with it the metallic taste of sand and smoke. Somewhere far off, artillery thudded like a heartbeat. Maxwell couldn't look away from the man's face, pale, boyish still beneath the grime. 26. Younger than him by barely a year. The kind of man who might have been fixing tractors in Kansas if not for this war. He felt the weight of the ampoule in his pocket. The glass was warm from his hand. What if it works? The thought came uninvited, desperate, half-mad. He imagined the consequences, a court-martial, loss of license, prison. Yet behind that fear flickered something else, the faint, stubborn refusal to let another man die because of rules written oceans away. He turned to Grace. Go get some rest, he said. She hesitated. You too, Lieutenant. But she knew that tone, quiet, final. She nodded and slipped out into the night. When the tent fell silent, Maxwell drew the ampoule from his pocket. The liquid inside caught the lantern light, gold and fragile, as if it held sunlight. He found a clean syringe, boiled the needle over the flame, and waited for the metal to cool. Wilson stirred once, eyes fluttering open. Is it bad? Maxwell froze. You've been through worse, he said softly. A ghost of a smile crossed the man's lips, then vanished. Outside, the moon was a thin blade cutting through the canvas. Maxwell loaded the syringe, every movement deliberate. His pulse hammered in his ears. He thought of the orders, of the colonel's voice, of the hundreds who died of infection this month alone. He thought of the smell that never left his hands. He leaned close to the sergeant's arm, found a vein beneath the bruised skin, and whispered, though no one could hear him. Hold on, James. Just, hold on. The needle slid in. The ampoule emptied. And then, silence. He watched for a reaction, any flicker of breath or twitch of muscle. Nothing. Just the slow rhythm of a man too far gone. Maxwell sat beside the cot, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Around him, the hospital murmured with distant groans, the buzz of flies, the scratch of sand against canvas. He stayed that way until his eyes burned and the lamp's flame guttered low. When the last nurse's footsteps faded outside and the camp sank into sleep, he looked once more at the man on the bed, the man they had already written off as dead, and whispered to himself, almost in prayer. That night, when everyone had gone to sleep, Maxwell gave the injection. 1. Without permission. Without hope. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At first light the desert cooled enough to remember what breathing felt like. The wind had died, the flies still slept, and the generator hadn't yet begun its morning cough. Inside the hospital tent the air was sour and still, the kind of silence that made you listen for ghosts. Grace Helton moved along the row of cots with her notebook pressed to her ribs, touching 2 fingers to throats, counting heartbeats the way some people count prayers. Names and times, a human ledger. She reached Sergeant Wilson without even glancing at his tag. She knew the shape of a man already surrendered to death. She pressed her fingers to his neck out of habit, expecting nothing. Then, faint, but there, one pulse. Another. Her own breath caught. She laid her hand flat against his chest. Cool. Not the burning marble heat of a man lost to fever, but something new, stubbornly alive. Sergeant, she whispered, the word an intrusion in that hush. His eyelids trembled. A cracked tongue moved across dry lips. Water, he rasped. The canteen slipped from her hand and clanged against the tray. Doctor, Joe. Her voice was too loud for Dawn, slicing through the tent like glass. Feet shuffled. Someone cursed. The generator groaned to life, flooding the canvas room with flickering light. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell stumbled in half-dressed, his shirt clinging with sweat and sleeplessness. He froze when he saw the impossible scene, Wilson, eyes open, breathing. Maxwell pressed a finger to the wrist, counting, then listening to the chest. The rhythm was steady, real. The infection smell, once thick and sour, had faded to the faint sweetness of antiseptic. 98, he murmured. Pulse strong. Grace handed him the thermometer. He waited, glanced down. 99.4. Colonel Laird burst through the flap, cigarette hanging from his lip, scalpel still in his hand as though he'd forgotten to put it down all night. What now? He barked, then stopped. He looked once at Wilson, once at the lieutenant, then stepped closer and put a hand on the man's forehead. He was septic, Laird said slowly. He shouldn't be, the sentence never finished. He pulled the bandage back, leaned closer, sniffed. The edges of the wound were clean, pink, not spreading. Drainage? Minimal, Maxwell answered. Impossible, the colonel muttered. He stared at Wilson the way a man stares at a miracle he doesn't want. The noise of the camp crept in, pots clanging, boots crunching sand, men whispering about what they'd seen. Grace poured a few drops of water between Wilson's lips. He swallowed once, then again, slower, deliberate. Did I make it? He asked, his voice paper-thin. Don't talk, Grace told him softly. Just breathe. The colonel paced, muttering half to himself. There's no precedent. Septicemia doesn't reverse. Not overnight. He stopped beside Maxwell. What did you do? Standard procedure. Debridement, fluids, morphine. Nothing else? Maxwell shook his head. Nothing else. His voice was even, but the lie scraped his throat raw. The day lengthened. The temperature rose outside, yet inside the tent a strange calm settled, like the air after lightning. Wilson's color improved hour by hour. By noon he was sleeping without morphine. Grace changed the dressings and found the wound cleaner than it had any right to be. The other patients watched in silence, the rumor spreading faster than infection ever could. By evening the entire ward seemed to breathe differently. Men smiled for no reason. Someone called it divine intervention, another whispered that the desert bred strange bacteria that ate the bad ones. Colonel Laird didn't comment. He sat at his desk and wrote with deliberate, reluctant strokes, March 15, 1943, Case 114-B, Unexpected Recovery. Unknown cause. He stared at the words until the ink sank deep into the paper, as if trying to bury the event inside it. That night, Grace found Maxwell sitting outside on a crate, cigarette burning low between his fingers. The moon was thin, the sand pale as bone. "He's going to live," she said quietly. He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Looks that way. You should be proud." Maxwell didn't answer. He thought of the vial, of the small act that could end a career, or start something far bigger. "Maybe I just got lucky," he said. "Luck doesn't stop gangrene," she replied, but she left him alone with his thoughts. Over the next days Wilson's fever vanished. His appetite returned. He started asking for a mirror. Grace scolded him like a child, then smuggled one from the nurse's tent. When he saw his reflection, sunken cheeks, beard like sandpaper, he laughed until it hurt. "Hell," he said, "I look like I crawled out of my own grave." The laughter startled everyone. No one had heard that sound in weeks. Laird inspected him again on the 5th day, searching for the relapse that never came. "You should be dead," he muttered. "Maybe next time," Wilson grinned. A small grin twitched at the corner of the colonel's mouth before he killed it. He turned to Maxwell. "When you're done playing God, Lieutenant, write your report." Maxwell nodded, though his stomach twisted. Each night he dreamed of the ampoule, its golden shimmer, the feel of the needle in his hand. He had destroyed the evidence, buried the glass under the refuse pit, yet he swore he could still smell it on his fingers. On the 7th morning, someone brought in a pair of crutches and leaned them against the wall like a dare. Wilson insisted on trying. Grace steadied him. The tent erupted with quiet applause when he stood, trembling but upright. Maxwell smiled, but the relief was thin. He felt the invisible eyes of the army, calculating, questioning. Miracles, in war, came with paperwork. Just after dusk, a jeep roared into the camp. 2 officers stepped out, clean uniforms, fresh insignia, the smell of headquarters about them. They spoke briefly to the colonel, who unfolded a sealed envelope with the caution of a man opening a verdict. His eyes moved down the page, once, twice. Then he looked up, straight at Maxwell. The tent fell silent. Even the generator seemed to hesitate. A week after the man everyone had already buried asked for water, James Wilson stood on his feet. But now the army wanted answers. He had rehearsed the truth a dozen times on the way to Algiers, but the ride over the cracked desert road shook the words out of order. By the time Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell stood inside the medical headquarters, his palms were damp and the collar of his uniform felt 2 sizes too small. The office smelled of ink, tobacco, and fear disguised as discipline. On the wall hung a map of North Africa riddled with red pins, each one a wound that never healed. Behind the desk, Colonel Henry Braddock of the Medical Research Division read from a thin folder, his tone dry and surgical. "Lieutenant Maxwell, you administered an unauthorized substance labeled Compound 42P. Confirm the source." Maxwell's voice cracked on the first word. "Found it among supply crates, sir. Labeled penicillin, experimental use only." Braddock's gaze lifted. His eyes were pale and hard, like someone who had stopped being surprised months ago. "Who authorized its use?" "No one, sir. The patient was dying." Braddock closed the folder. "That's not a medical defense. That's desperation." Across the room, a British liaison officer with the thin patience of a scientist leaned forward. "Where exactly did you obtain it, Lieutenant?" That vial was part of a shipment meant for restricted trials in Cairo. 3 doses total. One went missing during transport. You're telling me you found it in a food crate? Yes, sir. Left behind with surgical gauze. The liaison exhaled. Bloody Americans, he muttered, not quite under his breath. The colonel ignored him. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? That compound isn't cleared for broad use. If the man had died, you'd be standing in front of a court-martial, not me. Maxwell's throat tightened. But he didn't die. That's irrelevant, Braddock snapped. Then quieter, as if tasting the words for the first time, he lived. He leaned back, studying the lieutenant the way one studies an unexpected symptom. What was the patient's condition prior to injection? Septic. Fever at 103, gangrenous tissue, unresponsive to morphine. And after? Fever broke within hours. Infection reversed by morning. He's walking now. A silence stretched thin across the room. The colonel drummed his fingers once against the folder. Do you realize, Lieutenant, that what you're describing, if true, would rewrite every medical protocol we have? We've lost more men to infection than to bullets this year. Maxwell hesitated. I wasn't thinking about rewriting anything, sir. I was thinking about not losing one more. For a brief second, Braddock's expression softened, almost human. Then it vanished. He stood, pacing toward the window where the Mediterranean glared like a sheet of molten glass. You've forced our hand. London will want a report. They'll send men, ask questions. They'll want to know why a junior field medic in Tunisia succeeded where entire laboratories have failed. The liaison scribbled notes furiously. If his account is accurate, it confirms Fleming's compound works even under field conditions, he said. That means mass production. Distribution. The war could shift within months. Or it could kill 1,000 men if misused, Braddock countered. Maxwell's heart pounded. He hadn't come for glory or credit. But now, standing beneath the map where red pins multiplied daily, he understood the weight of what he'd done. One desperate act in the dark might ripple across continents. The colonel turned. Lieutenant, you'll remain in Algiers under supervision. No correspondence, no travel without permission. The War Office will review your case. Yes, sir. He saluted, but the motion felt hollow. As he turned to leave, the British officer stopped him. Lieutenant, he said, his tone more curious than cruel, do you realize you may have just changed the entire war? Maxwell didn't answer. Outside, the streets of Algiers pulsed with noise, trucks, vendors, the buzz of a city half at war and half pretending not to be. He walked toward the harbor, where ships groaned under new cargo. Somewhere out there, more crates of that golden medicine would soon be on the move. Back at the hospital, word spread faster than mail. Wilson's recovery became a legend told between tents, each version brighter, less believable. Men began asking for the shot that saved the sergeant. Supply officers searched records, medics whispered about stolen miracles. Maxwell tried not to read the reports, but he couldn't escape the feeling that the story had already left him behind. A week later, a sealed cable arrived from London, production authorized. Penicillin to be distributed across Allied fronts immediately. When Braddock read it aloud, he looked up at Maxwell and said quietly, "You should be pleased, son. History just turned in your direction." Maxwell nodded, but a cold weight settled in his chest. Because every victory has its shadow, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he kept seeing Wilson's face, the way his skin had healed too fast, the way his pulse had grown too strong, almost unnatural. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was luck, medicine, miracle. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the flies fell silent, he would remember the fevered whisper from the cot, water, and wonder if what he'd woken that night was entirely human. By late spring of 1943, the war smelled of rot and metal. The rains had passed, leaving behind a heat that baked everything, wounds, tents, tempers. Across Tunisia and Sicily, penicillin traveled by air in small metal thermoses, each packed in ice like treasure. They called it a miracle, but in the field, it was simply hope, rationed, measured, and rarely enough. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell had seen what it could do. He'd seen a man breathe again after everyone had written him off. But now every delivery came with orders stamped in red, use only on high-value personnel. The rule was clear. The war had learned to measure the worth of a man. One afternoon, near Enfidaville, a truck rolled in from the front, 3 still breathing, 2 fading. One was a 19-year-old private from Oklahoma, shrapnel buried deep in his side. The other, Captain Ernest Harrow, an intelligence officer, bleeding slower but deeper. Maxwell had 1 vial left. "Orders are orders," said Colonel Laird, his face gray with exhaustion. "Use it on the captain." The private's breathing rasped like torn paper. Harrow met Maxwell's eyes. "Do what you must, doctor," he murmured. The generator faltered, light flickering. Maxwell looked from one cot to the other, the small thermos heavy in his hand. 2 men, 1 chance. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Whose life is worth more?" Grace Helton stood silently in the doorway. She didn't speak, her silence asked more than any question could. Maxwell drew the liquid into the syringe. It caught the light, gold and alive. He hesitated, the needle trembling between 2 souls. Across the tent, another doctor muttered, "Science gives us miracles, and war decides who deserves them." Maxwell's jaw tightened. He set the syringe down, then picked it up again. Finally, he turned to the captain. His hand didn't shake this time. By dawn, Harrow's fever broke. The private was already cold. No one spoke about it, but silence was its own accusation. Later, Grace found his notebook open on the desk. A single line, "Every injection feels like playing God." Over the next weeks, penicillin arrived in smaller shipments, the requests multiplying faster than the doses. The drug became currency, traded for rank, reputation, guilt. Medics argued over who deserved saving. Commanders signed requisitions in pencil, afraid to commit their own conscience to ink. Sometimes, the medicine worked too well. A soldier in Sicily healed from gangrene in half a day. Another man's broken arm left no scar. Nurses whispered that the drug had changed, or that it changed them. Maxwell tried to ignore it. Superstition, he told himself. Fatigue. But each night, when the tents went quiet, he remembered Sergeant Wilson, the man he'd first injected in Tunisia. The way his eyes looked when he woke, alive, but distant. Then came the rumors. A corporal near Palermo survived a mortar blast and walked back to camp. He told everyone he didn't feel pain, any pain. His body healed unnaturally fast. He didn't sleep. He didn't tire. Grace brought the story to Maxwell one night while he cleaned his instruments. "They say he was treated with your batch," she said. "He hasn't slept in 4 days." Maxwell froze. "People don't come back from war the same," he said finally. But that night, he wrote in his journal again, "Every cure asks for something back." Outside, the wind hissed across the tents like a whispering crowd. The next morning, the rumors grew louder. Another soldier healed overnight. Another said he could no longer feel hunger or fear. The stories traveled faster than supplies. Maxwell buried himself in work, refusing to listen. Yet when a courier brought him a sealed envelope stamped Medical Command, Naples, something inside him tightened. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and froze at the name printed neatly across the top. Sergeant James Wilson, alive. Recovered. Location, Naples Military Hospital. For a moment he simply stared, heart hammering in his throat. He had believed the story ended that night in Tunisia. But as he held the letter, one thought grew colder than the desert wind. Maybe the miracle hadn't ended at all. Maybe it had only just begun. He came back quietly, like a rumor that no one wanted to believe. It was late autumn of 1943, in Naples, a city still bleeding smoke from the last bombardment. The British hospital sat on the hill above the harbor, its walls painted with salt and grief. And one morning, among the new arrivals, Sergeant James Wilson walked in under his own power. The nurses stopped when they saw him. Some remembered his name from reports passed like prayers along the front. The man who beat death. Newspapers had already turned him into a story, the miracle soldier, science defeats the grave. He smiled when they called him that. But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell had been transferred to the same hospital only a week earlier. When he read Wilson's name on the manifest, his pulse jumped once, then steadied into dread. He told himself it was coincidence. It never was. Wilson found him in the corridor after evening rounds, still wearing the faded tunic he'd been saved in months ago. "Doc," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Told you I'd make it." Maxwell blinked, studying him. He looked younger somehow, skin clear, posture straight, eyes sharp as polished metal. But something in his movements was too smooth, as if pain had been erased from him. "You look well," Maxwell said carefully. "Better than well." Wilson's grin widened. "I don't feel pain anymore. Not even when I cut myself shaving. It's like it's all gone. Even the memories. I try to think about that night in Tunisia, but it's like remembering someone else's dream." Maxwell stared. "That's unusual." "Is it?" Wilson asked. "I think it's peace." He laughed softly, and the sound made the hairs on Maxwell's neck rise. That night, Maxwell requested a full examination. Wilson agreed without hesitation. His vitals were perfect, too perfect. No scar tissue. No residual infection. His blood work came back impossible, regeneration off the charts, clotting time near zero, white cells higher than baseline but clean. He didn't even register fatigue. When the report reached London, a medical colonel wrote in the margin, "Specimen exhibits extraordinary recovery, monitor closely." Maxwell didn't need the reminder. He couldn't stop watching. During physical therapy, Wilson lifted weights double his own size and laughed when the attendants told him to rest. When they pricked his arm for a test, the wound closed before the cotton touched it. Grace Helton, now stationed with the British unit, saw it happen and went pale. "This isn't healing," she whispered to Maxwell later. "It's something else." He nodded, eyes hollow. "We cured infection," he said. "But what else did we change?" That evening he stayed in his office long after the lights dimmed, writing in his report by the flicker of an oil lamp. Healed. Physically. But not, humanly. The last word smeared under his pen as his hand trembled. He closed the notebook and sat in the dark, listening to the low hum of the hospital, the far-off echo of waves against stone. Weeks passed. Wilson became both a curiosity and a legend. Doctors paraded him before visitors. Officers shook his hand, calling him proof of progress. But Maxwell saw the difference growing. The man's laughter came too easily. His pulse stayed slow even when he was furious. And when he looked at you, it was as though he were looking through you, seeing something colder beyond. One night, a nurse found Wilson sitting in the ward surrounded by sleeping soldiers. He was motionless, staring at them for hours without blinking. When she asked if he was all right, he turned and said softly, "They're all going to die, but they don't know it yet. I can feel it." Then he smiled and went back to watching. Maxwell heard about it in the morning. He went straight to Wilson's quarters, but the bed was empty, sheets perfectly folded. The guard at the door said he'd left before dawn, walking toward the train depot. "Said he was fine, sir," the man added. "Didn't even take a coat." A search began, but Italy in '43 was chaos, part war zone, part graveyard. Weeks later, word came from a reconnaissance unit south of Salerno. They'd found a burned convoy. Dozens dead. One survivor. When Maxwell reached the site, the smell hit first: oil, blood, something scorched beyond naming. The medic pointed toward the wreckage. "You'll want to see this, sir." Among the bodies lay Wilson, alive, upright, skin unbroken. Around him, every other man was gone. He looked up as Maxwell approached, eyes calm as the sea after a storm. "Doc," he said quietly. "I told you I don't die easy." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind rattled the empty rifles. Then Maxwell whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe that's the problem." That night, back at the hospital, he opened his notebook again. The final entry for the day was short, written in a shaking hand. "He's alive. But I don't know what that means anymore." A month later, the file labeled J. Wilson, Case 114B vanished from the archives. And from that day forward, no one could say for certain whether the miracle soldier still walked among the living, or simply refused to stop. They called it the greatest discovery of the century. By 1944, penicillin flowed through every field hospital from Normandy to the Pacific, sealed in metal tins packed with ice. It smelled faintly of alcohol and salt, a clean promise in a world that had forgotten what clean meant. Newspapers printed headlines in triumphant black ink, "The wonder drug saves thousands." Doctors were heroes now. The war had found its miracle. But not everyone celebrated. In the quiet rooms behind the noise, some men sat staring at the little glass vials and wondered what they had started. Joseph Maxwell returned home in '45 to a world that didn't know his name. He stepped off the train in New York, greeted by brass bands and strangers waving flags. They were cheering for victory, for science, for salvation. He wanted to cheer too. But the noise felt hollow, like clapping in an empty church. A month later he stood on a stage at a medical conference in Boston, the hall filled with white coats and applause. His superiors introduced him as the man who witnessed the first successful field use of penicillin. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters scribbled. When the room finally quieted, he cleared his throat and said, "We learned to save the body. Now we must remember to heal the soul." The words drifted above the crowd like smoke, unanswered. He saw Grace Helton again that evening in the hotel lobby. She had aged in ways the mirror never shows, small lines near the eyes, the stillness of someone who'd held too many hands while they slipped away. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment the war seemed far behind. "You gave him life, Joe," she said softly. "Don't regret it." He looked down at the glass of water in his hand. "Sometimes," he murmured, "I think life is heavier than death." They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the muted hum of the city, the sound of people moving forward, never looking back. That night, in his hotel room, Maxwell opened the old field notebook he'd carried through the desert. The pages were brittle, stained with sweat, corners burned from candlelight. At the very end, beneath faded entries written years earlier, he added one more line. "War showed us how fragile life is. Science showed us how powerful mercy can be." He closed the book and set it on the desk, beside a small photograph, Grace, the hospital tent, and a blur of men who were once alive. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the city with the same steady rhythm as the sea. In the years that followed, factories expanded, penicillin production soared. By 1945 it was saving thousands a day, and by the next decade, millions. Every medical journal called it the dawn of a new age. No one spoke of the nights before dawn, of the hands that had shaken over a single syringe, of the men who had lived when they shouldn't, and the questions that refused to die with them. Sometimes, in lectures, Maxwell would glance at the back of the hall and imagine a familiar silhouette standing there, tall, still, expression unreadable. He never saw Wilson again, but once, walking home through a snowstorm, he thought he caught a glimpse, a man crossing the street without a limp, without a coat, vanishing into the blur of white. He never told anyone. Years later, when the war was just a chapter in history books, a new generation of doctors learned about penicillin's discovery. They memorized the names of chemists, generals, and corporations. None mentioned the nameless medic in Tunisia who broke the rules and changed the world. That was fine. History didn't need to remember him. It only needed to remember what he'd learned. Because every cure begins with a risk, and every miracle comes with a cost. From that night in 1943, when one dying man gasped for water and another refused to give up, the world began to change. Since then, penicillin has saved more than 200 million lives. But on that first night, in a torn tent beneath the desert stars, no one thought about history, or science, or glory. They just wanted someone to make it to morning.